Hi, my name is Ron Chervin, and I am the director of the sleep program at the University of Michigan, and I am delighted to speak to you today. In those early days of sleep, it's still a frontier field, but it was especially a frontier field back then, about which there were so many questions and so much we didn't know, and it just seemed like a fascinating world. So Charlie Pollack was a wonderful mentor, willing to take on an undergraduate student who knew basically nothing, and be a wonderful mentor. And it was a wonderful group. The group at Montefiore Einstein at that time was led by Dr. Elliot Weitzman, who's renowned in our field for some of the early work on endocrine issues and their intersection with sleep, neuroendocrinology and sleep, and also included Dr. Michael Thorpe. Dr. Dan Wagner was there. Dr. Mark Pressman was a postdoc at the time, and of course Dr. Art Spielman. It was just a wonderful, eye-opening place to be, and I retained that interest. So I worked, I think, 3 summers during college years, then went to Stanford for medical school, and went there in part because of all the work that they were doing there in sleep. When I interviewed Mary Carskadden, drove me to meet Bill Dement, and I was just in awe. And so impressed by his enthusiasm and her enthusiasm for the field that it really stuck with me. And with brief dabbles in epilepsy as a potential research field, I still returned to sleep by the end of residency. Worked again with Dr. Pollack. He had moved to Cornell. I worked in Westchester with him, and then chose a sleep fellowship at Stanford, and that was a 2-year fellowship back then, funded by the NIH, interestingly, through a T32, although it was a clinical year followed by a research year. And I think my fate was sealed after that. I heard wonderful stories about the early times in our field from both Charlie Pollack and Dan Wagner. Unfortunately, I don't think in the early 80s I was able as a student to go to the meeting yet. But I heard years later that it was totally different. The sleep meetings were small. They were 80 or 100 people, originally brimming with excitement, but everyone literally knew everyone. I think Charlie Pollack and Dan Wagner had a long history of going to a very nice dinner every year as part of the meeting. It's one tradition that I do now also with a friend. Over the years, I think I heard and witnessed how the meetings changed. Because I started going when I was a fellow. I believe my first sleep meeting wasn't to attend in person, although I had abstracts in the early 80s. The first one I went was probably 1993. I think it was at UCLA. It was in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, it wasn't at UCLA. And I remember that vividly. It was still much smaller than it is now, but already sizable, a lot of excitement. I don't think you could even know everybody at that meeting. But the field, the meetings were small enough that you could have festivities in the evenings that I remember that were very informal. I guess they were a precursor of our gala dinner now, but they were also memorable. And of course, the meetings are not just about the science. They're about seeing our friends, cementing collaborations across institutional lines. But for those of us who spend a little more than 40 hours a week in our work, our friends become our collaborators and our colleagues. And it's such an important part of of what's now called well-being, and part of the satisfaction we get out of life, both professionally and personally. So the meetings have always been a highlight for me. Now I don't think I've missed one, actually. I can't remember that I missed one for the last 30 years. So I got involved with the SRS before the ASM, and that was, I hadn't really thought about participating on a board level. I had volunteered on committees before that, and the SRS and the ASM. Then Sonia Ancoli Israel called me at one point in the mid-90s and said, would you like to consider participating on the board of the SRS? And I did that for 4 or 5 years. I ran for president, but Jim Walsh won. And back then there wasn't a plan to keep anybody on the board. If you ran for president and you didn't win, then you were done. But within a year of that, Cleve Kushida reached out to me from the board of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and said I was under consideration to participate in the board, and would I be interested in that? And I thought back and said, well, the time on the board of the SRS was productive, and the ASM is a whole other aspect and world, but also so critical and foundationally critical on the clinical side for our field. I said, of course, and then I went through the election, and so I started on the board of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine in 2010, and that went for 8 wonderful years that I really enjoyed and grew a lot personally. I felt like I could contribute also, but it was an important and central career development and career milestone for me. I really enjoyed that aspect of what our field has to offer. Well, the major issues are always changing. It seems like the ASM can pick a few things to be proactive about and choose to advance the field in those ways, but a lot of time is spent on putting out fires, and there were major issues. So, for example, in the 2010s and that decade, we were adjusting a lot to home sleep apnea testing, which kind of was sprung on the field in part through Medicare decisions, and then quickly thereafter decisions of insurers. And there was a substantial shift from a major portion of what we do being lab-based to now a whole nother venue opened up. It had been for many years. I brought home sleep apnea testing, at least the capability of it, to the University of Michigan when I started there in the mid-90s. But we used it only on occasion because it wouldn't generally be covered. 2010s, it was not only covered, but increasingly required. And that led to a lot of changes and a lot of challenges to adapt. There's no part of medicine that doesn't adapt and evolve. So that was one thing. There were all kinds of periodic maintenance kind of things. So the attention to the meeting, of course, which was growing and developing. Attention to the journal in those years. We actually went through a lot of careful consideration, decided to end, sunset the partnership that the ASM had with SRS for many years to run the journal Sleep. And so we basically sold the ASM interest to the SRS. And in those years also, the JCSM was coming to the forefront and became the rock anchor kind of for our society. in terms of where our research interests and productivity would go. Not that we abandon sleep, but in terms of where our development effort would go, it was that journal. There were many other issues. Of course, the definition of hypopneas, the AHI, that took a lot of time and work and careful considerations. The AASM just doesn't decide, okay, do this and go and do it. It's carefully thought out repercussions, wanted and unwanted, with regards to dealing with all other parts that affect our field, including CMS, for example. And so there was a lot of careful consideration about how and when to do all those things. One of the key things that we focused on was also the financial health of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Any academy can only survive like all of what we do if it's financially feasible. And we worked hard to take revenue that we had and grow it and invest it, and as close as we could to establishing almost endowment-like reserves for hard times and for when our field would really need it. And I'm proud to say that during that time, the financial reserves and power of the Academy really grew in an amazing manner. I have to give a lot of that credit to the executive director for those years, who was Jerry Barrett, who, not always uncontroversial personality, but he really managed to keep the Academy in, with input from the board, but he kept the Academy financially healthy and growing, and astoundingly successful if you even compare it to other professional organizations. And it's had so much impact, so much positive impact. So when I don't remember what the numbers were, but in the beginning of my time on the board, the amount that the Academy was able to give to the foundation to promote key research in our field was much smaller than it was at the end, and that trajectory has increased to where now it's $2 million and more a year that the AASMF is able to spend because of that financial health and base that the AASM developed. So it's ultimately it's an investment of everyone who's a member and everyone who in our field who contributes to the AASM, and their investment is, I think, stewarded very well to further benefit the field. And when I say the field, ultimately what the AASM does, which is another thing we worked on when I was on the board, is defining that vision. And basically our board in those years decided that the AASM exists to help promote members' ability to provide best possible care to patients with sleep and wake disorders. And although it sounds simple and easy when I say it, it's not that easy to distill that because there's always questions of, well, is the AASM there for patients and should everything we do be catered towards patients, or is it there towards the members, regardless of what happens to patients? But this is the distillation that came out of a lot of consideration and reconsideration, even to the point that we had that vision and our mission statements in front of us at board meetings. So printed on cards, we put it in front of us every time we came to a board meeting, and tried to never lose sight that we aim to assist our members in providing the best possible care to patients. And that can be through research, or that can be through the journal, or that could be through the meetings, or that can be through the guidelines, guideline papers and the other publications, or that could be through accreditation. And that's something that I grew to respect so much of our academy and our professional organization, in that it it has become central to how we practice on a daily basis for all those reasons. And it's hard to go through medicine, in sleep medicine, and not need and benefit from what the Academy does. So I'm not sure that other fields are quite like that. I think that other professional organizations do play important roles, but I see others that focus only on meetings or mainly in one area or one on the other. But ours has really succeeded to help its members in all these fundamental ways, connect its members. And I don't want to sound like a commercial to the AASM. I think everyone who's going to see these videos is probably, I'm preaching to the choir, but it is a respect that's really only grown over the years that I've had for what the AASM does and achieves, and how much it's been fundamental to helping advance a field that in our lifetimes, well, my lifetime certainly, has gone from 0 to 60, and beyond. I mean, it was really, in those summers when I was working as a volunteer in sleep, people would say, "Oh, wow, that's really interesting," but it's kind of a fad, don't you think? Everybody thought, sleep was on the cover of New York Times or something one day, but 2 years from now, we're not going to be hearing about it. And even when I was a resident in the 90s, early 90s, it was there was some of that sense still. And even when I became a junior faculty member in the mid to late 90s at the University of Michigan, people still didn't know about sleep. When I phoned someone at our School of Public Health because I wanted a partner in sleep apnea research, a very renowned faculty member said, "Sleep apnea? What's that? Can't be much importance. I never heard of it." And that's also something that the Academy has, with I'd say a lot of good success and good contribution, fought to counter and fought to put sleep and sleep apnea, but as well as the dozens of other disorders that we address, in the public imagination, through CDC grants, through careful work with PR firms that know how to get sleep in front of, as they say, in front of eyeballs. How many eyeballs can you get with this an article here? We've had great volunteers from the membership who volunteer to represent the AASM when these media opportunities come up. And I personally, I essentially never say no. I either say, yes, I'll help, I'll speak to somebody, or I help find someone who will, because that's part of our mission, that education part, getting the word out about sleep, getting people to realize how fundamental it is to good health and well-being. Personally, I'm astounded that the well-being argument alone doesn't carry the day. But if you go to NIH or you go to the public, either forum, it always helps to make the argument that sleep is actually a matter of life and death in the long run. Fundamentally having impact on cardiovascular health, on brain health, metabolic health, and go down the list, just about everything. Everything I mean, and a lot of my own career has been spent on trying to get that message out in the various areas that I do research on. And the areas I do research on are in part informed by what's going to help educate and open people's eyes. So after many years, for example, of telling patients that why they need to use their CPAP, and that we have good evidence, if not proof, that it's going to help their cardiovascular health or help other aspects of their health, I realized that there's one thing that we could do better. And so we did a small project using photogrammetry, which is a fancy camera system that allows you to take essentially three-dimensional pictures. And we took pictures of patients before and then a few months after treatment for obstructive sleep apnea. And we then took the pictures and asked raters, both lay personnel, public, as well as medical people, to look at the pictures, and they saw a before picture and an after picture of the face. And they had to say which picture looked more alert and which looked more attractive, and which did they think was before and after. And both people beat the odds, and they could tell the difference. And so now I can tell people, there's a good chance you're going to look better if you, and I think that turns some heads. I'm just giving that as an anecdote of the kind of strategies that we can go to try to get people to be as committed as possible to work with us in their treatment for a disorder that otherwise people just assume it's part of life, and you can go on being sleepy forever, and isn't everybody sleepy? Yeah, I've had the blessing, wonderful opportunity to work with some of the leading figures who have shaped and developed our field. And I'll start with, again, fortuitously, my mentors and the people who got me along the way. Actually, I remember I met Chuck Zeisler and Gary Richardson at a very young age. I was an undergraduate and interviewing for medical school, and they were my interviewers, and they told me go to Stanford, and I did go to Stanford, and so and they had connections with the Montefiore group too that I had worked at. So in part it was a small circle. During my sleep fellowship, I had the immense fortune to work with wonderful mentors, including Christian Gilmano, who's certainly, I don't know of anyone more colorful who contributed to our field. He was a force of nature, as my wife would say, with uncanny insight. He wasn't always right, but he was usually right. And he was usually right 10 or 20 years in advance of where the solid evidence was to say where the field was going to go next, or how we were going to help patients in a good way. Be it cardiac arrhythmias, be it behavior of children with sleep disorders, be it upper airway resistance syndrome. He was a font of knowledge. He was extremely well-read. And what was best was that he was never hesitant to share his opinion, and privately or publicly. As you know, he lived a wonderful, long life and contributed immensely in many ways, having only passed away in recent years. But I still miss him, and I think he really is responsible for a lot of my own fascination and sense of wonder in our field. And I think the other major thing he did was tie in American, U.S. sleep medicine with the rest of the world. And he was tireless in terms of trying to turn heads and sharing that enthusiasm to the point that I think it did our field a major favor by spreading what eventually amounted to sleep services, sleep research, sleep interest to many other countries. I had the privilege to work with Michael Aldrich. So I went to the University of Michigan after a fellowship in Stanford, in large part because he was there and already had established a wonderful reputation, along with Sid Gilman, who was chair of neurology at that time, for mentoring junior faculty. He was particularly interested in narcolepsy. I was particularly interested in sleepiness, and so it was a very good match. And he played a huge role. One of the things he did was alert me somewhat to what things I had learned in fellowship were opinion versus fact, which I didn't always know at the time. But more than that, he was just a wonderful mentor. He taught me how to write, and he taught many others as well. I remember I was a fellow long enough for Christian Gilmano to tell me at one point, Ron, you have a serious problem. You don't know how to write. But he didn't necessarily fix it, maybe because I wasn't there long enough. But Michael Aldrich spent hours with a red pen. So, when I was writing a manuscript in those early days, I get it back with more red than black on the page. But that was really a testament to his dedication to teaching and to the field. He was very active in getting the early board for sleep medicine going, which helped with the recognition of our field as a bona fide independent field. And then in the years since then, I'd say that I've had, again, such luck to work in large part through our professional organizations with some of the people who have played key roles in advancing it. And so I remember working closely with Nancy Collop, with Pat Strollo, with other past presidents of the board, including Safwan Badr, Tim Morgenthaler, Sam Fleischman. Each of them had strengths and really, I don't want to call them superpowers, but they came to the board and to the AASM with specialized knowledge that you couldn't get any other way unless you got to work with these individuals. And I think it's a little bit like a video game where you go and collect powers from your various characters, and you're always putting them in your knapsack or whatever. And you don't steal powers or anything, but you, in essence, these individuals give you the chance to broaden your own perspectives and broaden your experience, and not have to say, I have no idea, the next time an important question comes up. And so there are many others, on the research side who have also been role models for me and people I've looked up to. I'd say there's too many to name them all, but one that clearly comes to mind is Susan Redline, whom I've worked with for over 20 years and benefited incredibly from her intellect, her knowledge of research methods, the rigor of what she does, and her willingness, like the others, to share that, collaborate, and I think without which I don't think our field would be the same. I've learned a lot from my colleagues in pediatric sleep medicine. I'm not trained as a pediatrician, which I'm always the first to admit it, but I've always had a fascination for. I got that interest early on in fellowship with Christian Gilmano, who also was not a pediatrician. And both he and Michael Aldrich, after I'd asked repeatedly, are you sure it's okay for me to work in this area, even though I'm not a pediatrician? And they said, yes, sleep is small enough field, you can contribute well anyway. And I think they were right. In the end, I've really enjoyed that aspect. I got interested as a fellow because these patients who would come in, these children, literally bouncing off the walls, before they would be treated with sleep apnea. After you treat them, lo and behold, they don't need their ADHD medicines anymore, their medications. And so that led to a series of R01s that I applied for and got at the NIH. And I'm very grateful for all the people that helped along that way. That in my career, which a lot of my research was focused on these issues of cognition and behavior, in childhood in relation to their sleep disorders. And I'd say Michael Twerry had a huge impact. He navigated a very challenging job at the NIH in terms of heading the National Center for Sleep Disorders Research, and navigated it because of his dedication and a huge amount of time that he put into it. Had to navigate politics, had to navigate multiple constituencies, still found time to help individuals like me anytime I called, or anytime I wanted to bounce off a specific AIMS page or get feedback on ideas. And he wasn't hesitant to say what was stupid or what wouldn't be funded in my lifetime, or you know, what to, how to strategize and how to present something. So I've got to say that he played and it continues, even though he stepped down now, and Mariska Brown has taken his role and is really running with it. But he still makes himself available as a consultant. Recently did grand rounds for us at the University of Michigan. And so the other people, Carol Marcus played a huge role for me, and she encouraged me every step of the way. Early on with my research, she helped acted as an advisor on my K Award originally, even though we weren't at the same institution. And even though as an adult neurologist, she was fine with it. And she gave me one of the nicest compliments once at a pediatric sleep meeting where I was speaking, and she said, "Ron, I think you're an honorary pediatrician by now." So I always remember that. I miss her. But she like the others I've had the luck to work with, it was hugely advanced our field and the pediatrics especially, but even more broadly than that. David Gozal has been a friend and a mentor in some ways for years. And then I would have to mention Carol Rosen also, who's always been open with her time, ready to share what she's doing on the clinical side or on the research side. We've collaborated now for many years, starting with the CHAT study, the childhood adenotonsillectomy study, which was involved several centers, and then the PAT study, the pediatric adenotonsillectomy study for snoring, essentially for mild sleep disorder breathing in children. So those are the people that come to mind. I think I could probably spend 2 hours more, but well, I forgot one other person who you can't forget. Bill Dement. So Bill Dement headed the sleep disorders program, in essence, not so much on the clinical side, but over the years I was a fellow there, but in terms of giving the program direction, and especially on the research side. And I've got to say, he's also been an incredible, key, fundamental father of the field, if you will. And there were a few fathers, but he was unique. Unique in his passion, unique in the science that he contributed, unique in his optimism for the field, even when it was challenging. So I also count myself very lucky to have not worked closely, but to have known him for many years, enjoyed that friendship, enjoyed everything that he's contributed. And I'd say that no 50-year AASM anniversary celebration would be complete without remembering him. The AASM is sleep medicine. It is, and it's so central to sleep medicine that I can't imagine either one without the other. I think that if there's ever history books, not only of the AASM, but of professional organizations. I think the AASM would deserve a strong part of it, because it has so well integrated itself, so well enmeshed itself, and so much advanced our field. It enmeshed itself with the field, and so much developed the field that I think the two are inseparable. And you know, I talked a bit about the people that I've admired and that I've worked with in the AASM. But one thing that deserves mention also are just the staff of it. The staff of the AASM. So when I left the board, 2018, I think there were about 62 staff. There's now about 80. So in 5 years, it continues to grow, and it continues to grow in hugely productive and effective ways. And the staff had generally been dedicated, erudite, you know, I don't want to say cheerleaders, but they're in a sense they're cheerleaders, but they are also they're the engine that really keeps the AASM going, because the physicians, you know, they have their day jobs, and it's the AASM that puts together the guidelines, you know, that helps get all the research so that the physicians can evaluate it in one place, that ran the journal for many years, that organizes these meetings starting years in advance, finding the venues, answering questions that they get all the time from membership that's always calling, running the accreditation. I mean, there's multiple departments, multiple areas. The development, that was one of the things that I worked on the year I was president, and I was glad to have as a lasting contribution, is that there's a development department that now, you know, tries to get the support that we need for in new ways for everything that we do. And so I just want to give a shout out to the staff of the AASM, who have been incredibly important to the field as well.